Today's episode is brought to you by the latest book in the Epic Fails series.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Epic Fails of History.
The Age of Exploration, Totally Getting Lost. By Eric Slater and Ben Thompson. Mistakes are the portals of discovery. James Joyce, Ulysses. Lost at sea. If at first you don't succeed, you're not the only one. In fact, you're in pretty good company. The Age of Exploration was an era of discovery. Fearless pioneers set sail into the unknown in search of new lands, adventure, and fortune. At a time when most of the world was still a mystery, these brave souls risked everything to glimpse what lay beyond the horizon. By land and sea, early explorers traveled to the far corners of the globe and occasionally found themselves hopelessly lost. On October 7th, 1492, Christopher Columbus stood on the rocking deck of the Santa Maria, gazing out at uncharted waters with all the confidence of Captain Kirk. Though he was sailing headfirst into unfamiliar territory, Columbus was certain that he'd set foot on Chinese land at any minute. Unfortunately, the same could not be said of his 87 crew members. They had been at sea with Columbus for 29 days. That's 29 days without fresh supplies. 29 days drifting in the middle of the ocean with nothing but water as far as the eye can see in every direction. Have you ever been on a really boring car ride? Like, your parents want to visit some park in the middle of nowhere, so you spend all day driving down the highway without anything exciting to look at, or anything fun to do except listen to your dad sing a bunch of dorky songs you've heard a million times. For the crew, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, traveling with Columbus was kind of like that. Except, instead of 8 hours in a car, they'd been at sea for an entire month. Oh, and there weren't really any gas stations to buy snacks, so if they ate all their food, they would starve to death. Throughout the Age of Exploration, the life of a seafarer could be so unpleasant that English writer Samuel Johnson once said it was like being in jail, but with the added possibility of drowning. If the dangers of sea travel weren't bad enough, the awful conditions aboard the ship might make you want to take your chances in the open ocean. The food was as terrible as it was limited. The most common food available was barrels of old salted meat and this really gross stuff called hardtack, which was just flour and water, basically a rock made of gluten. Scurvy was a constant problem among the crew because of the lack of veggies. Bugs and rats were everywhere, and disease was rampant. Hygiene was non-existent, and everything smelled horrible. Many people died from minor infections due to minor injuries or getting knocked overboard while trying to rig up the sails. The crew worked 4-hour duty shifts day and night, and slept packed together on the floor or in hammocks in the cramped, dark, stuffy space below decks. Sea shanties, card games, and gallons of whiskey were all that kept them going at times. Disobedience was answered with a whipping, or time in the brig. Mutiny, if unsuccessful, was met with death. Now, 29 days into their mission, Columbus's crew members had all come to the same conclusion. They were almost at the point of no return. These hardened sailors knew the ships were carrying about 60 days' worth of supplies, and if Columbus didn't turn back really soon, the crew wouldn't have enough food to get them all home alive. Chapter 6. Cabeza de Vaca, Cast Away in Mexico. 1527 to 1536. On June 17, 1527, a Spanish fleet of 5 ships with a crew of 600 set sail for Florida. In April 1536, almost 9 years after their departure, the last 4 survivors of the disastrous expedition were discovered wandering around Mexico. This legendary journey, recorded by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, is a perfect example of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will. In 1527, King Charles I of Spain chose Spanish conquistador Governor Panfilo de Narvaez to lead an expedition to Florida to pick up where the famed Ponce de Leon had left off by establishing a permanent colony in the name of Spain. He was given permission to settle all the land between Rio de las Palmas in modern-day Mexico and Florida. basically the entire Gulf of Mexico region. Many Spanish nobles joined him with dreams of wealth and power. Among them, Andres Dorantes, Alonso del Castillo, Maldonado, and Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca was the expedition's royal treasurer. He came from a military background. His grandfather was a famous conquistador, and he decided to continue the family business. Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Castillo set sail for Florida in search of glory, but their voyage was cursed from the moment they departed. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was long and grueling. Not only were the travelers cramped together with tons of smelly farm animals, but they also had barely enough to eat and were getting tossed around below decks like they were in a wooden washing machine. This month-long journey was so unpleasant that after arriving in Hispaniola for supplies, 140 crew members decided they had had enough sailing for one lifetime and stayed behind in the Caribbean. Little did they know, they were 140 of the luckiest deserters ever. What remained of the crew sailed to Cuba, where they picked up more supplies for their expedition. That's when it started to rain. And then the weather got worse. Like, way worse. The wind howled and thunder cracked. As the sails of Cabeza de Vaca's ship threatened to blow away, a messenger urged the treasurer to come ashore to oversee the transfer of goods. Cabeza de Vaca refused, not wanting to leave his ship behind with the storm picking up, but the messenger eventually convinced him. When Cabeza de Vaca got to shore, they got hit by a full-blown hurricane. You see, back in the day, there were no meteorologists to predict things like hurricanes and fierce thunderstorms, so sailors just had to hope for the best. Cabeza de Vaca and the others had seen bad storms before, but none had ever experienced anything quite like this. Huge trees were thrown like footballs, and houses collapsed as if they were made of toothpicks. The Spaniards huddled together and tried to find shelter. The native Tainos called it hurricane, meaning big wind, but Cabeza de Vaca saw it as a terrible omen of things to come. The next morning, after the wind had died down, the shaken survivors made their way to the shore to find that both of their ships were missing, and they'd lost 60 good men to the storm. A mile down the beach, they found a rowboat stuck in a tree. As stubborn as Narvaez was, even he had to admit this was a bit of a setback. They postponed their voyage for a year while they did their best to replace their ships, their crew, and their horses. Cabeza de Vaca and others were starting to have second thoughts, but Narvaez was still determined to make something out of his miserable time in the New World. However, Florida was no longer his primary goal. Narvaez changed direction when he heard rumors that riches were flowing from Rio de las Palmas in Mexico, and he wanted to be the first to claim all that sweet treasure to himself. This new course meant they would need to find a new navigator, someone who knew the region. They found a man by the name of Diego Morello to pilot the fleet. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that Morello had no idea where he was going, or that he knew even less about piloting a ship. He was as overconfident as he was incompetent and inexperienced. Morello managed to run the ships aground on multiple occasions before they even left Cuba. To make matters worse, they ran into not one, not two, but 3 more increasingly violent storms. Only 42 of their 80 horses survived the trip. The crew was in bad shape. Thanks to Morello's skill, when they finally spotted land on April 12, 1528, they weren't just 900 miles off course. They were on the wrong side of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Florida, Tampa Bay to be exact. Regardless, Narvaez assumed they were on the right track, after Morello convinced him that Rio de las Palmas was no more than 30 miles north. It wasn't. Cabeza de Vaca wasn't an idiot, he voiced his concerns, but Captain Narvaez was undeterred. He planned to head up the coast by foot to their destination. Instead of turning back, Cabeza de Vaca and about 300 soldiers decided to follow Narvaez on his suicide mission, stumbling aimlessly into the depths of Florida. Everyone else said, "No thanks," got back on the ships and sailed away. Nobody ever saw them again. After about 4 months of trudging through swampland, fending off native tribes who saw them as trespassers, and getting hopelessly lost, the remaining 250 Spaniards realized they'd made a terrible mistake. They set up camp at Apalachee Bay, hoping for a search party, but rescue never came. After being forced to eat their horses to avoid starvation, the castaway crew planned one last-ditch effort to make it across the Gulf of Mexico. They melted their guns down into tools and nails and got to work. Together, they managed to build 5 makeshift rafts out of logs and, I kid you not, horsehair, sewing their shirts together as sails. MacGyver would have been proud. Between September and November, the makeshift flotilla made its way west along the Gulf Coast, past what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, sailing over 750 miles. They were all slowly dying of thirst when they were miraculously saved by the fresh water at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, the Mississippi pushed them farther out to sea, where they all soon became separated. Then, without warning, they were hit by, you guessed it, another hurricane. Narvaez's raft disappeared into the storm, tossed and turned through the churning waters, never to be seen again. Only 2 of the 5 rafts made it to shore intact. Cabeza de Vaca woke up to his raft crashing onto the shore of an island off of Galveston, Texas. Coincidentally, Dorantes and Castillo's raft washed up on the opposite side of the island. Weak and hungry, they slowly crawled onto dry land. Of the original colonists, only 80 now remained, and their problems were far from over. Epic Fails: The Age of Exploration is available now.